It was a dark and stormy night in the quiet town of Zoba, a small town in the heart of Kwara State. The rain pounded on the tin roofs of the houses, and the wind howled through the empty streets. Inside one of these houses, a young woman named Amina sat in front of her computer, staring at the screen. Her heart raced as she read the message that had just appeared in her inbox. "Hello beautiful, I can't wait to finally meet you. I've arranged everything. Just come to my place this weekend. It's going to be amazing. I'll pick you up at the bus station." Amina's heart fluttered with excitement. She had been chatting with a man named Ken for weeks now. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to be everything she had ever wanted. They had met on a dating site, and from the first message, she felt a connection that she had never experienced before. Ken lived in a city called Olinla, a few hours away from Zoba. He had been asking her to visit him for a while, and now, finally, she was going to do it. But deep down, there was a tiny voice in her head that warned her to be careful. She had heard stories about people meeting strangers on the internet and getting into trouble. But Ken wasn't a stranger anymore, she told herself. They had been talking every day. He even sent her pictures of himself, pictures of his house, and his dog. He was real, she was sure of it. Ignoring the voice in her head, Amina packed her bags and told her parents that she was going to visit a friend in Olinla for the weekend. They were hesitant at first, but Amina assured them that she would be fine. She was 22, old enough to make her own decisions. The next morning, Amina boarded the bus to Olinla. The journey was long, and she spent most of it daydreaming about what it would be like to finally meet Ken in person. She imagined him waiting for her at the bus station, smiling, with flowers in his hand. They would spend the weekend together, getting to know each other even better. When the bus finally pulled into the station, Amina's excitement was at its peak. She grabbed her bags and stepped off the bus, scanning the crowd for Ken. And there he was, just like in the pictures, tall, dark, and handsome, with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Hey, Amina," Ken said as he walked up to her. "You made it. It's so good to finally see you in person." Amina smiled shyly, feeling a rush of emotions as she looked into his eyes. He was even more attractive in real life. They got into his car, and as they drove to his house, Ken kept the conversation light and funny, making her laugh and feel comfortable. But as they got closer to his house, the atmosphere began to change. The roads became narrower, and the houses became fewer. Amina noticed that they were heading out of the city, towards a more secluded area. "Are we almost there?" Amina asked, trying to hide the unease creeping into her voice. "Yes, almost," Ken replied, but his tone was different now, less cheerful. He didn't look at her as he spoke, and Amina's heart began to pound with anxiety. When they finally arrived at the house, it was nothing like the pictures he had shown her. The house was old and isolated, surrounded by tall, dark trees that seemed to close in on them. The windows were boarded up, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Amina's unease turned into fear. "This isn't the house you showed me," she said, her voice trembling. Ken didn't answer. He got out of the car and walked to her side, opening the door. "Come on, let's go inside," he said, his voice cold and distant. Amina's heart raced as she looked around, realizing that there was no one else around, no neighbors, no passing cars. She was completely alone with him. "Ken, I think I want to go back to the station," Amina said, her voice shaking. Ken's smile disappeared, and his eyes turned dark. "You're not going anywhere, Amina," he said, grabbing her arm with a grip that sent chills down her spine. Panic surged through Amina as she tried to pull away, but Ken's grip tightened. "Let me go," she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the dense, suffocating silence of the place. Ken dragged her towards the house, and Amina's heart pounded with terror. She realized that the man she had trusted, the man she thought she knew, was not who he said he was. And now, she was trapped, with no one to help her. As the door to the house creaked open, Amina's mind raced with thoughts of escape. But deep down, she knew that it was too late. She had walked right into a trap, and there was no way out. The darkness inside the house swallowed her as Ken pulled her in, and the door slammed shut behind them, sealing her fate. In the town of Zoba, Amina's parents grew worried when they didn't hear from her. They tried calling her, but her phone was off. Days passed, and their worry turned into dread. They reported her missing to the police, but there was little they could do. Amina had vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, in Olanla, Ken continued his search for his next victim, hiding behind the mask of charm and lies that had trapped so many before. The house in the woods remained silent, a place where secrets were buried deep, and where those who entered never returned. And so, the darkness spread, one victim at a time, as Ken continued his twisted game, while the town of Zoba waited, hoping against hope that Amina would one day come home. But deep down, they knew that she never would. In the days that followed, the air in Zoba grew heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Amina's family refused to give up hope, clinging to the possibility that she might still be found. Her mother, Zainab, was especially distraught, unable to sleep or eat. She spent hours on the phone, calling relatives, friends, and anyone who might have a lead on Amina's whereabouts. But every call ended in the same despairing silence. Amina's father, Al-Haji Musa, was a man of few words, but the sorrow in his eyes spoke volumes. He had always been strong for his family, but now, his strength seemed to be crumbling. Each day that passed without news chipped away at his resolve. The police in Olanla had little to go on. They questioned people at the bus station, searched the routes Amina might have taken, and even visited Ken's supposed address. But the house he had described was nowhere to be found. It was as if Ken had never existed, as if Amina had been swallowed by the earth itself. Back in Olanla, Ken moved through life with the same easy charm, hiding his true nature behind a carefully crafted facade. He continued to frequent online dating sites, luring unsuspecting women with sweet words and promises of love. His next target was a young woman named Bisi, a university student from Ilorin. Bisi was bright and full of life, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Like Amina, she was drawn to Ken's charisma and the attention he showered on her. He made her feel special, like she was the only woman in the world. As their online relationship deepened, Ken began to plant the idea of meeting in person. He spoke of a weekend getaway, just the two of them, where they could finally be together without the barriers of distance or screens. Bisi was hesitant at first, but Ken's persistence wore her down. He was patient, always knowing the right things to say to ease her fears. When the weekend arrived, Bisi told her friends that she was going to visit her cousin in Olanla. She didn't mention Ken to them, thinking they might judge her for meeting someone from the internet. She packed her bags, full of excitement and a little nervousness, but with no real sense of danger. As Bisi boarded the bus to Olanla, she had no idea that she was walking the same path that Amina had taken, heading towards the same fate. Meanwhile, in Zoba, Zainab couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her daughter. She began to pray more fervently, asking God for a sign, for anything that could lead them to Amina. It was during one of these prayer sessions that a thought struck her, something Amina had once mentioned in passing about the man she was chatting with. She had spoken about a dog, a detail that Zainab had dismissed at the time but now seemed significant. Zainab rushed to the police station, this new detail burning in her mind. She explained it to the officers, hoping it might help them narrow down their search. The officers listened, taking down the information, though it seemed like a long shot. But Zainab wasn't ready to leave it at that. She began her own investigation, reaching out to people in Olanla, using social media to try and connect the dots. She searched for anyone who might have seen or heard of a man fitting Ken's description, a man with a dog. Days turned into weeks, but Zainab refused to give up. In Olanla, Bisi arrived at the bus station, scanning the crowd for Ken. Just like with Amina, he was there, smiling, waving, and making her feel at ease. They drove to the house, and Bisi's excitement grew with every mile. But as they moved further from the city, her excitement began to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. When they arrived at the old, isolated house, Bisi's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't what she had imagined. The house was eerie, surrounded by tall trees, just like the setting of a horror movie. She hesitated as Ken opened the car door for her, but his warm smile and reassuring words coaxed her out. "Come on, you're going to love it here," he said, taking her hand. But as they walked towards the house, Bisi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, the silence too deep. She tried to pull her hand away, but Ken's grip tightened. "Ken, I "I don't feel so good," Bisi said, her voice trembling. Ken's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "You'll feel better inside," he said, pulling her towards the door. Bisi's heart pounded as she realized she was in danger. She had to think fast, to find a way out before it was too late. She tried to stall, asking questions, looking for any excuse to turn back. But Ken was relentless, his grip like iron. As they stepped inside the dark, musty house, Bisi's fear turned to panic. She tried to scream, but Ken clamped a hand over her mouth, dragging her deeper into the house, into the same darkness that had swallowed Amina. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the house stood silent once again, a place where hope faded, and from which no one ever returned. Back in Zoba, Zainab's relentless search began to bear fruit. She connected with a woman who had been chatting with a man who fit Ken's description. The woman had become suspicious and had stopped communicating with him, but she had saved their conversations. She shared these with Zainab, who took them to the police. The police began to piece together a profile of Ken, using the information from Zainab and the woman. They searched for any record of him, any clue that might lead them to his real identity. But Ken was careful, covering his tracks, using false names, and moving from place to place. But Zainab wasn't deterred. She knew she was getting closer, and she prayed that it wouldn't be too late for Amina, or for any other girl who might have fallen into his trap. As the police intensified their search, Ken continued his game, unaware that the walls were closing in on him. But the darkness he had created was vast, and it would take more than just hope and prayers to bring it to an end. In the meantime, the house in the woods remained a place of nightmares, where secrets were buried deep, and where the echoes of the past lingered, haunting those who dared to enter. As the days passed, Bisi's absence began to alarm her friends in Ilorin. They hadn't heard from her since she left, and their messages went unanswered. At first, they thought she was just caught up in her weekend getaway, but as the days turned into a week, their concern grew into fear. One of Bisi's closest friends, Funmi, decided to take matters into her own hands. She called Bisi's cousin in Olenla, hoping to find out if Bisi had arrived safely. When the cousin revealed that she hadn't seen or heard from Bisi, Funmi's heart sank. She knew something was terribly wrong. Funmi went to the police, just like Zainab had done, but her report was met with the same frustrating response. There was little they could do with the information they had. But Funmi wasn't about to give up. She remembered Bisi mentioning a man she had been talking to online, a man she was excited to meet. Funmi knew that if she could find this man, she might be able to find Bisi. She logged into Bisi's social media accounts, searching for any clues, any messages that might lead her to the mysterious Ken. After hours of scrolling and searching, she found their chat history. Reading through the messages, Funmi's heart pounded with fear and anger. This man had charmed her friend, just like he had probably charmed others before her. Funmi took screenshots of the messages and brought them to the police, along with every detail she could find about Ken. She pleaded with them to take action, to search for her friend before it was too late. Meanwhile, in the isolated house in Olenla, Bisi was living a nightmare. Ken had locked her in a small, windowless room, where the only light came from a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were cold and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Bisi had tried to scream for help, but no one could hear her. She had tried to escape, but the door was solid and unyielding. Ken visited her once a day, bringing her food and water, but his demeanor had changed. The charming, sweet man she had met online was gone, replaced by a cold, emotionless figure. He never spoke more than a few words to her, and his eyes held no warmth, only a chilling emptiness. Bisi spent her days and nights in terror, unsure of what would happen next. She thought of her family, her friends, and how she might never see them again. She regretted ever trusting Ken, ever coming to this place. But regret couldn't save her now. One night, as Bisi lay on the cold, hard floor of the room, she heard a faint sound, a creak of the floorboards, as if someone was walking through the house. Her heart raced with hope. Maybe someone had come to help her, maybe someone had found her. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear more. But as the footsteps grew closer, Bisi's hope turned to dread. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, and they stopped right outside her door. There was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door swung open, and Ken stood in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. Bisi's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her fear paralyzing her. "Why are you doing this?" Bisi managed to whisper, her voice trembling. Ken stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. For a moment, Bisi was frozen, unsure of what to do. But then she realized, this was her chance. She had to escape, now, before Ken changed his mind. She got to her feet, her legs shaky, and ran towards the open door. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get out of the house, out of this nightmare. She sprinted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she reached the front door, she heard Ken's voice behind her. "You can't escape, Bisi. There's nowhere to go." But Bisi didn't stop. She threw open the door and ran out into the night, into the cold, dark forest that surrounded the house. The branches scratched at her skin, and the ground was uneven and treacherous, but she kept running, fueled by pure terror. She could hear Ken's footsteps behind her, getting closer. She knew she couldn't outrun him forever, but she had to try. She had to find help, find someone who could save her. But the forest was vast and endless, and Bisi was soon lost in the darkness. She stumbled and fell, scraping her hands and knees, but she forced herself to get up and keep moving. She had to keep going, had to stay ahead of Ken, but as the minutes ticked by, Bisi's strength began to wane. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind foggy with fear. She could hear Ken's footsteps getting closer, could feel his presence closing in on her. Finally, she collapsed to the ground, her body unable to go any further. She tried to crawl, but her limbs were too heavy, too weak. She lay there, panting, as the footsteps stopped right behind her. She felt a hand grab her arm, pulling her up. She struggled, but it was no use. Ken was too strong, too determined. He dragged her back through the forest, back to the house, back to the darkness. As they reached the house, Bisi knew that her chance of escape was gone. She had tried, but it wasn't enough. She was trapped, just like Amina, just like all the others. But even as she was pulled back into the house, back into the room where her fate awaited her, Bisi made a silent vow. She wouldn't give up. She would keep fighting, keep looking for a way out. She wouldn't let Ken win. She wouldn't let him break her. In Ilorin, Funmi's persistence was starting to pay off. The police had finally begun to take her seriously, and they started investigating the information she had given them. They tracked down Ken's online profiles, traced his IP addresses, and began to piece together a trail that led them to Olinla. They were closing in on him, getting closer every day. But would they be in time to save Bisi, or would she become just another victim, another name on the growing list of missing women? The house in the woods remained silent, a place of unspeakable horrors, where the echoes of the past lingered, and where the darkness grew deeper with each passing day. But the walls were closing in on Ken, and soon, his carefully constructed facade would begin to crumble. And when it did, the secrets of the house would be revealed, and justice would finally come for those who had been lost in its shadows. Days turned into nights, and the tension in Olinla grew as the police continued to close in on Ken. They were methodical, piecing together every scrap of information Funmi had provided, while also interviewing others in the community. The more they learned, the more they realized just how dangerous this man was. Ken had evaded capture for a long time, using different identities and living in isolated locations. But now, his web of deceit was unraveling. Back at the house, Bisi's condition worsened. The confinement, the fear, and the isolation took a toll on her mind and body. She had stopped eating the food Ken brought her, partly out of defiance, and partly because her appetite had vanished. She spent most of her time lying on the cold floor, her thoughts drifting between hope and despair. Ken, meanwhile, was growing restless. He knew something was wrong. He could sense that the police were getting closer, that his time was running out. He had seen a few unfamiliar faces in town recently, and he suspected they were undercover officers. The tension gnawed at him, making him more erratic and unpredictable. One evening, as Ken sat in the dimly lit kitchen, sipping a drink and staring blankly at the wall, he heard a sound that sent chills down his spine, a siren in the distance. He bolted up, his heart pounding, and peered out the window. The night was dark, and the sound was faint, but it was enough to make him panic. Ken knew he had to act fast. He couldn't stay in Olinla any longer. He had to leave, to disappear again, but this time, he needed to cover his tracks completely. He couldn't leave any evidence behind, especially not Bisi. Ken grabbed a duffel bag and began shoving items into it, clothes, money, and anything that might be useful on the run. But as he packed, a thought struck him: what about Bisi? He couldn't just leave her behind, she would eventually be found, and she could lead the police to him. He considered taking her with him, but the risk was too high. As he stood there, wrestling with his options, the siren grew louder. Panic surged through him. He needed to decide, now. In a moment of cold, calculated decision, Ken made up his mind. He would finish what he had started. He grabbed a rope from the garage and headed towards Bisi's room. His footsteps were heavy, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. Bisi, who had been in a daze, slowly turned her head to see Ken standing there, the rope in his hands. For a moment, their eyes locked, and a silent understanding passed between them. Bisi knew what was coming. She had seen it in his eyes before, that same cold, emotionless stare. But something inside her refused to accept it. She couldn't let him do this, not without a fight. As Ken approached, Bisi summoned every ounce of strength she had left. She lunged at him, scratching and kicking, her survival instincts kicking in. Ken was caught off guard, stumbling back as she fought with all her might. But he quickly regained control, using his strength to overpower her. As they struggled, the sound of the siren grew closer, now accompanied by flashing lights visible through the window. Ken was desperate, his movements frantic as he tried to restrain Bisi. But Bisi wouldn't give up. She bit down on his hand, causing him to yelp in pain and loosen his grip. In that split second, Bisi broke free and ran towards the door, her legs weak but fueled by adrenaline. She burst out of the room, sprinting down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ken was right behind her, cursing and shouting, but Bisi didn't stop. She reached the front door, flung it open, and ran outside into the night. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't slow down. She could see the flashing lights in the distance, the siren blaring. She ran towards them, her only thought being to reach safety, to survive. Ken, realizing that the police were closing in, stopped chasing her. He knew it was over. There was no escape this time. In a last-ditch effort, he turned and ran in the opposite direction, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Bisi kept running, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She could hear the police shouting, their voices urgent. She waved her arms, screaming for help, and within moments, the officers spotted her. They rushed towards her, their faces a mixture of relief and concern. Bisi collapsed into their arms, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She was safe, finally, after what felt like an eternity of terror, she was safe. The police quickly surrounded the area, combing the forest in search of Ken. They knew he couldn't have gone far, but the darkness and dense trees made the search difficult. They set up roadblocks and called in reinforcements, determined to capture him before he could slip away again. As Bisi was taken to the hospital, where she would receive the care and support she desperately needed, the hunt for Ken intensified. The officers knew they were dealing with a dangerous man, a predator who had evaded justice for too long. They wouldn't rest until he was found. Back in Ilorin, Funmi received the news that Bisi had been found alive. The relief was overwhelming, and she broke down in tears, thanking God for her friend's safety. She knew that Bisi's journey to recovery would be long and difficult, but at least she had survived. That was all that mattered. As the first light of dawn began to break over Olinla, the search for Ken continued. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But somewhere in that vast, dark expanse, Ken was hiding, waiting for his next move. But this time, he was alone. His carefully constructed world had crumbled around him, and there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. The shadows that had once protected him were now closing in, and soon, there would be nowhere left to hide. And as the sun rose higher, casting light on the secrets that had been buried in the darkness. The end of Ken's reign of terror drew nearer, with justice only a breath away.